Welcome to Promethean Action's weekly class for February 7th, 2026. This is Tony Pappert. Tonight's class is the Core Five, an international alliance for the American system with Will Wertz. And I'll be bringing on Will Wertz in just a second. On December 9th, the magazine Defense One reported that an unpublished draft for the U.S. national security strategy, which was being released back then, called for the U.S. to bring together a group of five powers: the U.S., Russia, China, India, and Japan, the Core Five, as a world force for peace and a stabilization factor in the world. Its first task would be consolidating peace in the Middle East. Now, this idea was not published as part of the national security strategy when it came out, but it's nevertheless extremely important, as you'll be learning tonight. It has explosive implications, especially after today's speech by Secretary of State Rubio at the Munich Security Conference just took place. In an impassioned speech, Rubio told the European powers assembled there that the U.S. was going to go on fighting for, defending, forwarding, and expanding Western civilization, even if they have dropped the struggle and turned against it. So it's an explosive development, just happened today. And in fact, Promethean Action has a YouTube video on it, just posted to our channel, YouTube channel, Promethean Updates. Now, nobody is better qualified to discuss this than Will Wertz or William Wertz. William Wertz spent many years working on this concept, as he'll describe, with the late Lyndon LaRouche. Will literally wrote the book on it, a book he'll show you as we progress, called Beware the British East India Company. So you're going to hear about a critical development of today, a new turn in history from somebody who's uniquely qualified to explain it. I do have to say in disclaimer that Promethean Action has no connection with Helga Zepp-LaRouche or any of her organizations. So with that, let me bring in Will.
Hi, thank you very much, Tony. So tonight, as Tony just indicated, what I want to do is discuss this Core Five concept, which apparently was in an early draft of the U.S. national security strategy, which was released at the end of 2025, in December of 2025. And the importance of this is that it mirrors a proposal which Lyndon LaRouche put forward over decades. For instance, in 1988, when he was running for president, Lyndon LaRouche gave a speech in Andover, Massachusetts. At the time, he was running in the New Hampshire primary. And I think the event was in Andover, Massachusetts, because a site in Bretton Woods was not available. But in that speech, he put forward a concept of creating a new Bretton Woods involving the United States, Japan, and the, at that time, sovereign nations of Western Europe. And I would like to just read an excerpt from that speech, because it tends to reflect the philosophy that's being put forward by the Trump administration including in this national security strategy, and also in Secretary of State Marco Rubio's speech at the Munich conference today. What LaRouche said at that point is, and remember, this is before the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And also at that time, the nations of Europe were sovereign nation states. The European Union was only created after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1992-93. And that created a supranational government in Europe, which has led to the decline of Europe, which Marco Rubio was addressing in his Munich speech. So what LaRouche wrote or said at that time was the forces in Japan, which agree with this kind of policy, that is creating a new Bretton Woods system to correct the disaster which occurred after President Nixon abandoned the original Bretton Woods system in August 1971. That abandonment of the old Bretton Woods system led to globalization and a policy of controlled disintegration of the world economy. Marco Rubio, in a speech in Munich, made the point that our intention is not to manage the decline. He might just as well have said the disintegration of the world economy, the economy of Europe, or the economy of the United States. We're going to correct that. We're going to reverse that. So what LaRouche argued is that the forces in Japan, which agree with this kind of policy, would join with it immediately, and they would become predominant in Japan as opposed to others who tend to be pro-monetarist. He continued, what we have to reach is an agreement on creating a monetary system which would get the United States, Japan, and Western Europe, or most of those nations, to agree on a new basis for pegging currencies to fixed prices, going back to a gold reserve standard for that purpose, to issue credit at agreed terms of credit, to have a schedule of priorities on the issuance of credit, and to have regular meetings among various countries, developing and industrialized, to set priorities and goals for imports, exports, and investments. He said, instead of the United States, Japan, and Western Europe trying to take in each other's laundry by selling to each other across the fence, Japan and Western Europe will be told, no more, except in very specialized categories such as spaghetti, pasta, good European wines, and so forth. We've got to have that for the U.S. population. But in the high-ticket items, such as consumer goods, get out of it. The United States is not going to be your market anymore for these kinds of consumer goods. So you can see that LaRouche was addressing the imbalances in global trade as far back as 1988. Now, can you just put up the first graphic of the core 5, Tony? Okay, as Tony indicated, Defense One, U.S. publication, on December 9, put out a story that the national security strategy, which had not yet been released, had a proposal to create a core 5 grouping involving the United States, Russia, India, China, and Japan. What the staff reporter, Megan Myers, wrote at the time was, over the summer, President Trump made headlines when he lamented the expulsion of Russia from the Group of 8, now the Group of 7. It's a very big mistake. He even suggested that he'd like to see China added to form a Group of 9. His national security strategy proposes taking a step further, creating a new body of major powers. The strategy proposes a core 5 made up of the US, China, Russia, India, and Japan, which are several of the countries with more than 100 million people. It would meet regularly, as the G7 does, for summits with specific themes. And as Tony indicated, the first such agenda item would be Middle East security, specifically normalizing relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, but also addressing the issue of peace more broadly than just in the Middle East, and trying to resolve conflicts among nations throughout the world, including among the great powers. Could you put up a graphic of the Beware the British East India Company book, please? In 2023, after resigning from my position in the Schiller Institute, as president of the Schiller Institute for 27 years, and resigning from any association with Helga Zeb LaRouche, whose views I believed departed from the best features of Linda LaRouche's legacy, I wrote this book. And what it calls for is an alliance between the USA, Russia, China, and India to finally defeat the British Empire. And it includes a proposal for such an agreement among these four powers. As I said, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and shortly thereafter, the Western European nations lost their sovereignty under the Maastricht Treaty. And so therefore, the original proposal of LaRouche for Japan, USA, and Western European countries to form a new Bretton Woods was no longer relevant. This proposal so this idea of a four-power agreement is a precursor to this core five idea. Could you show the next graphic this is a book by Linda LaRouche, of which I was a co-author. It's called The Four Powers. So you get the idea. This is a long-standing proposal of Linda LaRouche, and it's coming into prominence now in the form of this core five concept. Could you show the graphic of GDP by purchasing power parity? Now, GDP figures are notoriously not completely accurate because they include non-productive investments. And the purpose of this chart is not to show whose economy is larger. According to straight GDP, the United States is the largest economy in the world. The point of this graphic and the next graphic is to just show you that the core five nations are the biggest economies in the world. And they are much larger, for instance, than, and this includes China, Russia, India, Japan, and the United States, much larger than, for instance, our erstwhile European allies, the UK and France, which are doing everything they can to perpetuate their own decline and ensure that peace does not break out in the world, particularly in Ukraine. Could you show the next chart, Tony? It's the same theme, just showing this concept of GDP by purchasing power parity. And again, these are the five most important and largest economies in the world, most of which are not China, India, Russia are not represented, for instance, in the G7. And the members of the G7, which includes the United States and Japan, but the other members are really much smaller economies. And this core five proposal, building on the four power concept, provides an avenue for addressing problems in the world, which the G7 does not allow. Okay, now, after this proposal was made, Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus, the president of Belarus, made a comment about the significance of this proposal. Let me just find it here. What he said, and this was covered by Newsmax on December 18. I have heard from the media that Trump is ready to create a bloc of 5 states: Russia, China, Japan, United States of America, and India. I think if this union is established, the world will be a completely different place, and this will happen in a short period of time. Probably after Europeans failed to understand what Trump wants, Trump turned to Asia because that is the main center of future development. And this is something which LaRouche emphasized repeatedly. He emphasized that the future of the world economy is in Eurasia, and you have to take a long-term perspective of 50 years. And if you do that, you can actually develop the economies of the world and eliminate in the process the causes of war in those areas. So that was Lukashenko of Belarus. Now, I would also like to point out that that following this discussion of a core 5, which I believe was in an earlier draft of the national security strategy, Trump went ahead and created the Board of Peace. Now, the idea of a Board of Peace was supported initially by the United Nations Security Council. It voted for the idea of a Board of Peace to resolve the conflict in Gaza in particular. The Board of Peace that President Trump created is not limited to Gaza. In fact, in the charter of the Board of Peace, there's no reference to Gaza per se. So what President Trump has created is a mechanism, an institution for resolving conflicts and wars even beyond the Middle East. Its initial focus is the Middle East. And of course, the initial agenda item on the core of 5 was stabilization of the Middle East. So I believe that there's a connection between the core 5 concept and President Trump's Board of Peace. Now, it's interesting to note that President Trump invited approximately 60 nations to join the Board of Peace. That included Russia, China, India, and Japan. Lukashenko of Belarus went ahead and joined the Board of Peace. And I think that reflected his understanding of the core 5 concept and the potential for the Board of Peace. President Trump indicated at one point that President Putin had committed to joining the Board of Peace. Well, the Russians themselves have said that President Putin is considering doing so. But President Putin went one step further and said that once the war in Ukraine is resolved and Russian assets, which are frozen in the United States, are unfrozen, that he would contribute $1 billion to the Board of Peace. So I think if you look at the Board of Peace, and let me also point out that all of our so-called allies in Europe have refused to join the Board of Peace. This includes the UK, it includes France, it includes Germany, various Scandinavian countries, and so forth. Also, there's an organization called the Five Eyes, which was set up after World War II. It's an alliance of intelligence agencies, which includes the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. In fact, this Five Eyes organization was involved, as all evidence points to, in the attempted overthrow of President Trump through the Russian hoax. But the point I want to make is that the UK refused to join, Australia refused to join, New Zealand refused to join, and Carney of Canada agreed to join, but then his invitation was rescinded after his hostile remarks directed at President Trump at the Davos summit. So 4 of the 5 eyes, that is, all of which were involved in operations against President Trump, are not on the board of peace. Japan has not yet responded. China has not yet responded, and India has not yet responded. But I think I think you see the connection between the board of peace and the core 5 concept. And of course, President Trump is going to be making a trip to China in April. He previously characterized his relationship with President Xi of China as representing a group of 2, a G2. So I would not exclude China joining the board of peace. I would not exclude India, which is very close to Prime Minister Modi, very close to President Trump. I wouldn't exclude their joining, nor would I exclude Japan joining, given that the new Prime Minister of Japan has a supermajority in the Japanese Parliament and is closely aligned with President Trump. So this is a way to ensure that there's a broad alliance and which is not stifled by the European Union and the United Kingdom and France and their entente cordiale, with France being the junior partner. It's a way of bypassing this grouping, which, as Secretary of State Rubio pointed out, is characterized by Malaise and let's see what he pointed out in a speech. Malaise of hopelessness and complacency, or even worse, in the way in which they're deliberately fomenting war with Russia in the case of Ukraine. So I think what you've got here is a dynamic. It may not, at this point, there may not be a core of 5 group, but a number of the core 5 nations have not yet joined the board of peace. But what you can see is the dynamic, which is oriented towards collaboration, conflict resolution among the actual great powers, both civilizationally, economically, militarily, in the world, so that we can actually get things done, as opposed to not the impotence which the United Nations unfortunately represents right now. The United Nations hopefully will improve its behavior and get its act together, but the world can't wait for that, as Secretary of State Marco Rubio pointed out in a speech in Munich. Okay, now, what I want to now do is, one thing I want to point out is that the relationship between Russia and the United States is going to be key in terms of putting together either a 4-power agreement or a 4-power plus 1 agreement. And again, this concept is not exclusionary. It's a great power relationship, which can has the potential, as LaRouche have used to emphasize, of dismantling the Anglo-Dutch imperial system, which is not Western civilization. Western Christian civilization is, as Marco Rubio pointed out in the speech in Munich, unique, and we should be proud of it. We shouldn't be acting in terms of shame of our past as a civilization. But Western civilization is not the British or the Dutch East India Company. It's not the imperial policies of the British Empire, or France, or of the Netherlands, or Spain. we as Americans, or most of our ancestors, came here, and the same in terms of the rest of the Western Hemisphere, to escape the oligarchism, the imperialism, which dominated Europe, has dominated Europe, and there's been a fight in Europe, and we're, in a certain sense, the highest expression of that fight, the founding of the United States of America. And what Rubio did in his speech, he referenced the positive contributions of Western civilization in the arts: Beethoven, Mozart, Dante. There are many that he didn't mention, but he went through this. And our ancestors, actually, in the United States and elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere, got here because they fled that oppression, which has tried to stifle the spark of creativity, which was launched by the Golden Renaissance in Europe, and in the 1500s. And it was that Renaissance which created the nation state. Whereas globalization and globalism are the modern form of imperialism. And so what the Trump administration is doing is emphasizing the principle of national sovereignty, as opposed to the imperial policies of globalization, which took over after the Bretton Woods system was abandoned. That's when you had the outsourcing, the deindustrialization of the United States, of Europe, and so forth. You had all of the things which Rubio went after in his speech, including the climate change ideology. He didn't mention it, but the idea of post-industrialism, we no longer need industry, and the entropic idea that there are limits to growth. And so, as he points out, the only fear we have is the fear of the shame of not leaving our nations prouder, stronger, and wealthier for our children, and I might add, grandchildren. Now, it's not accidental that the national security strategy was written by the policy planning office of Marco Rubio's State Department. The person who headed up that department was an individual by the name of Michael Anton. And if you look at that national security strategy document, it lays out really a grand strategy, which is a departure from the so-called rules which have dominated and led to the decline of Europe, the decline in many respects of the United States of America, which we're now in the process of reversing. And I'd like to go through some of the features of that. But actually, there's one thing which I skipped, and I just want to add it. This is an article by in Bloomberg Noon, which occurred just a few days ago. This is it's in February 12th. It's entitled "Russia Memo Sees Return to Dollar System." And what Bloomberg reports is a memo which they claim has circulated in Russia. It's called the Dmitriev packet. It seems to be some version of this seems to be the proposal being made by Kirill Dmitriev on behalf of Putin and the Russians in the negotiations with the United States and with the United States. The Ukrainian war is a significant feature of this, but this is a negotiation to stabilize relations with the U.S. and Russia. And what it basically says is that what the Russians are offering is to not go with de-dollarization, but rather to continue with the U.S. as the global reserve currency. What this memo also apparently calls for is a rejection of low carbon emission technologies like solar and wind power, and a commitment to fossil fuels, but also a commitment to nuclear power. So you see the outlines of an agreement between the U.S. and Russia, which can then easily be, well, it'll entail difficulties, but it can be easily extended to the other great powers. And perhaps if you're talking about keeping the U.S. dollar as the international reserve currency, then you have to be talking about fixed exchange rates, pegging the dollar to a gold reserve system once again, reversing the damage that was done by Nixon's decision under pressure from the UK and the French at that time to abandon the Bretton Woods system and go to floating exchange rates. All right, so let's look at this document, and I would just say that I think it's very clear that this document shows the influence of Lyndon LaRouche's ideas. We may not know exactly how those ideas were conveyed to the policy planning group, but I would suspect that there are probably people on that policy planning group who are familiar with Lyndon LaRouche's ideas. And this is not unprecedented because, for instance, in the late 1970s, going into the Reagan administration in the 1980s, Lyndon LaRouche worked very closely with the National Security Council in the United States. He worked with the National Security Council under Reagan in back channel discussions with the then Soviet Union on President Reagan's strategic defense initiative. And of course, now you've got the Trump administration pushing for a golden dome, which would utilize many of the scientific principles which would have been entailed in the strategic defense initiative at that time. So the influence of LaRouche's ideas at high levels of the U.S. administration is not unprecedented, and the similarity of the ideas that are being expressed with those of Lyndon LaRouche leads one to the conclusion that LaRouche's ideas are having an influence on the policy of the United States of America under the Trump administration. Now, if you look at the national strategic, the security strategy, and also the national defense strategy, which was put out later, it's very clear that the basic principle of this document is a rejection of globalization, an assertion of the principle of national sovereignty, a rejection of deindustrialization of the U.S. economy through outsourcing and through unbalanced trade relations, both with our rivals such as China, but also with many of our allies in Europe, and in particular also Canada, which after all is a British colony. King Charles III is the King of Canada, and Mark Carney was the head of the Bank of England, and his brother Sean Carney is the chief operating officer of Kensington Palace. So we should, when we look at Canada, we have to remind ourselves of the fact that they never declared their independence from the British Empire, and they have always been used as a tool against the United States of America. Now, particularly in light of Marco Rubio's speech in Munich, where he defends Western Christian civilization, and says that we shouldn't we're going to be unapologetic about Western Christian civilization and its contributions to the world. And he's addressing the Europeans in particular and saying that we're a child of Europe. And what we want you to do is to abandon your pessimism, your malaise of hopelessness, and regain your footing. So in the document, the National Security Strategy document, there's a whole section on the European Union, and what it says is that Europe is facing civilizational erasure. And this is not just as a result of the mass migration to Europe, which was a result of President Obama's Arab Spring initiative to overthrow Gaddafi in Libya, to overthrow Assad in Syria, to overthrow Mubarak in Egypt, and so forth. What we see with the migration and initially out of Libya was that it was the terrorists who overthrew Gaddafi, who were supported by MI6 and the Obama administration, who were being paid by migrants to get a boat ride across the Mediterranean, just as the drug cartels do the same in bringing people under the Biden administration across the U.S.-Mexican border. So it's not just migration. It's the climate change, the transition from fossil fuels to windmills and solar power. You cannot sustain a civilization and an industry, a nation state on the low energy flux density nature of those forms of energy production. As Howard Lutnick said at Davos, Europe is going to windmills and solar power, and you need batteries, but Europe doesn't even produce a battery. Who produces batteries? The Chinese. So they're just basically according complete dependency upon China as opposed to being self-sufficient and embracing industry, technology. And one of the things that Rubio said in his speech, which I thought was quite good, is that just to address the fact that Europe, you cannot be paralyzed into inaction by fear of climate change, fear of war, fear of technology. Instead, we want an alliance that boldly races into the future. All right. So in this discussion of the EU, what the national security strategy says is that the EU's transnational regulations undermine creativity and industriousness. And should the present trends continue, the continent will be unrecognizable in 20 years or less. And he points out, the document points out, it is a core interest of the United States to negotiate an expeditious cessation of hostilities in Ukraine in order to stabilize European economies, prevent unintended escalation and expansion of the war, and reestablish strategic stability with Russia, as well as to enable the post-hostilities reconstruction of Ukraine to enable its survival as a viable state. And it continues, the Trump administration finds itself at odds with European officials who hold unrealistic expectations for the war, perched in unstable minority governments, many of which trample on basic principles of democracy to suppress opposition. You probably saw that a U.S. congressional committee released a list of 8 elections in Europe recently that have been intervened in by the powers of the EU in violation of national sovereignty and the principle of government by the consent of the governed. This is the EU monstrosity. And what it calls for is reestablishing conditions of stability within Europe and strategic stability with Russia, enabling Europe to stand on its own feet and operate as a group of aligned sovereign nations, which it is not now under the EU. So effectively, the U.S. policy, security strategy is that you've got to foster sovereign nation states in Europe as opposed to a supranational government. It's one of the reasons they won't talk to neither Rubio nor the Russians will talk to Kallis, the High Commissioner of the European Union. He also says the document also says that the U.S. will cultivate resistance to Europe's current trajectory within European nations. Also, it calls for ending the perception and preventing the reality of NATO as a perpetually expanding alliance. Overall, as I said, the policy is against globalism and for the nation state. The document reads, for too long, Washington has encouraged its friends and allies to cede their sovereign decision-making authority, often to anti-American transnational bodies, such as the European Union, and increasingly, the World Trade Organization. So the U.S. policy is in opposition to such transnational policies which emanate from the European Union, the World Trade Organization, the Paris Climate Treaty, and which has completely infected the United Nations and other international organizations. The document reads, in the Declaration of Independence, and this is important given it's the 250th anniversary of our Declaration of Independence, America's founders laid down a clear preference for non-interventionism in the affairs of other nations and made clear the basis. Just as all human beings possess God-given equal natural rights, all nations are entitled by the, quote, laws of nature and nature's God to a, quote, separate and equal station with respect to one another. And the document goes on to say, we seek good relations and peaceful commercial relations with the nations of the world without imposing on them democratic or other social change that differs widely from their traditions and histories. So we can collaborate ecumenically with other nations, even if they have different histories and traditions. We're not going to engage in regime change. It then goes on to say the world's fundamental political unit is and will remain the nation state. That's what Western Christian civilization is all about. It's about the concept of the nation state, sovereign nation state, and the concept of government by the consent of the governed, which is a principle in our Declaration of Independence. Now, on that question, though, the sovereignty of a nation state, as Linda LaRouche did emphasize, nations are almost perfectly sovereign, almost. They are only subordinated to the principle of natural law. And natural law has to do with the concept of creative reason and the concept of consent, government by the consent of the governed. And if a nation state is violating the concept of government by the consent of the governed, and its policies are completely at odds with creative reason. For instance, it's destroying its economy. It's producing drugs and inducing either its population or another nation's population to consume mentally destructive and physically destructive drugs. Then that nation is in risk of losing its claim to national sovereignty. Now, it also stresses that the document, the days of the United States propping up the world order like Atlas are over. That's not our perspective. The perspective is to achieve a realignment among nations through peace deals. And that is exactly what you see President Trump doing. ending 8 wars in 1 year. That is the operative principle of the American foreign policy. It goes on to say, Alexander Hamilton argued in our republic's earliest days that the United States must never be dependent on any outside power for core components necessary to the nation's defense and economy. And this is right in the preamble of the U.S. Constitution, providing for the common defense. And you cannot do that if you deindustrialize, and if you are not ensuring that you have access to the necessary core components in terms of minerals and so forth required for your defense, which also has to do with the general welfare of your population, also in the preamble to the U.S. Constitution. So it reads, the future belongs to makers. The United States will reindustrialize its economy. We reject the disastrous climate change and net zero ideologies that have so greatly harmed Europe. Now, there are 2 other sections that I want to go through. The Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And then the other area I want to go through is the what it discusses in terms of Indo-Pacific, in particular China. Now, what President Trump is doing is reasserting the Monroe Doctrine. The Trump-Monroe Doctrine is coherent with that of John Quincy Adams and Monroe. It is different from Theodore Roosevelt's. Theodore Roosevelt wanted the United States to operate as an international police force, and in particular, for debt repayment. That's what the Theodore Roosevelt corollary had to do with. This is not President Trump's. President Trump's Monroe Doctrine actually calls for, he says, the goal is for our partner nations to build up their domestic economies, while an economically stronger and more sophisticated Western Hemisphere becomes an increasingly attractive market for American commerce and investments. The linkages created between America and partners will benefit both sides. So on the one hand, the Monroe Doctrine entails you can't have somebody running a government who is trafficking in drugs in the United States of America. The United States of America is a national sovereign nation too, and if you are trafficking drugs into the United States, that's violating our national sovereignty, and that's a criminal operation, which we can't have. And we want our allies in the Western Hemisphere and elsewhere not to facilitate mass migration, which violates our national sovereignty as well as the sovereignty of other nations, including Europe. What the national security strategy calls for is the use of 2 entities for economic development of the Western Hemisphere and potentially elsewhere. There are 2 government entities. One is the International Development Finance Corporation, which was authorized in 2018 under the so-called BUILD Act, and it was formed in 2019. And it initially had an investment cap of $60 billion. In 2025, last year, the investment cap was increased to $205 billion. I would point out that Marco Rubio is chair and vice chair of the International Development Finance Corporation. Scott Bessent is a member of the board, as is Howard Lutnick. So this bank or finance corporation is a mechanism for actually increasing exports to developing sector nations in the global South, probably with an initial emphasis on the Western Hemisphere, but not limited to that. The other agency is the Export-Import Bank. The Export-Import Bank was created by Roosevelt as a subsidiary of the Finance Reconstruction Corporation. And the Export-Import Bank was used to fund the building of capital goods in the United States, which could then be used, for instance, to build the Pan American highway from Chile to Alaska, and also to build the Burma Road from Burma to China during World War II. So these two agencies and the Export Import Bank's budget went from 70 billion to 205 billion as well. And one of the projects that the Export Import Bank is now involved in is a 10 billion project vault to secure critical mineral supply chains for the United States. So these two agencies are mechanisms which have now been set up to facilitate the U.S. participating in developing the economies of our partner nations, which is an important aspect of stopping illegal migrations because you're developing the economies of these nations. All right, now that's the Monroe Doctrine, and this is something which Lynn and LaRouche in particular really stressed, the principle of the Monroe Doctrine. And most people around the world are misinformed about the Monroe Doctrine and think it's imperialist because they associate it with Teddy Roosevelt's corollary for debt repayment. It's not that. All right, in terms of Indochina, the United States wants China to be part of a core 5, 4 powers plus 1, or a 4 powers agreement. And that's possible, but China's going to have to make certain adjustments in its economy because China will readily admit that they're the nation that benefited most from globalization to the detriment of other countries. The Chinese talk an awful lot about a win-win situation, but when you benefit from globalization to the detriment through deindustrialization and outsourcing of another nation, that's not exactly win-win. That's win-lose. So it would be advantageous to them, as well as all the nations of the world, to agree to a new Bretton Woods agreement, which essentially will cut back on some of their what they consider to be advantageous to them, but will actually benefit them in the long run. And the things that the United States wants to eliminate are predatory state-directed subsidies and industrial strategies. The Chinese subsidize their exports, so they can actually dump goods at a lower cost than can initially be produced in the targeted nation. Unfair trading practices, job destruction, and deindustrialization, these are things that have got to be corrected. Threats against our supply chains that risk U.S. access to critical resources, including minerals and rare earth elements, exports of fentanyl precursors that fuel America's opioid epidemic. The National Defense Strategy makes very clear that the policy of the United States is not regime change in China. It's not to bring about a war with China. It's not confrontational. That's not its intent. What the National Defense Strategy says is maintain a favorable balance of military power in the Indo-Pacific, not for the purpose of dominating, humiliating, or strangling China. This does not require regime change or some other existential struggle, rather a decent peace on terms favorable to Americans, but that China can also accept and live under is possible. Set conditions for a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific that allows all of us, the United States, China, others in the region, to enjoy a decent peace. Now, because Japan and India are obviously, along with China, active in the Indo-Pacific, the idea of a 4 powers agreement or core 5 involving China makes absolute sense. So what I'm saying is that even though the core 5 does not appear in the final version of the National Security Strategy, what is in the National Security Strategy is coherent with the dynamic involved and the principle involved in collaborating among these 5 nations to bring about peace. And the fact that the Board of Peace is not limited to Gaza. Gaza is not even mentioned in the Board of Peace Charter. But rather the Board of Peace is meant to be used anywhere in the world to bring about peace. shows again this principle of the core five being operative. Now, could you just show just the board of peace? We have a graphic on that. Well, those are okay. The board of peace, and then you can go back to the other two. It's just the cover of the national security strategy uh, and of the national defense strategy. I The final thing I want to just emphasize is that is Jameson Greer's speech at Davos, Hamilton's Hamiltonian economic system that too many have forgotten. Because this speech gives you a sense of the economic policies which can dominate this four power or core five alliance in opposition to the British Empire and its remnants. It's supranational remnants, whether that's the World Trade Organization, the Paris Climate Treaty, or the European Union itself. And if you read this document, which I highly recommend, and it has been covered on the Promethean Action previously, but what he's talking about is Alexander Hamilton's policies, and you can see that the national security strategy also references Hamilton. It references Henry C. Carey, the advisor to Lincoln, who wrote a book called Harmony of Interest. And it also references Friedrich List. Friedrich List was a German who came to the United States, became an American citizen. He was brought to the United States by Lafayette, General Lafayette. And he wrote a book called National System of Political Economy, which stresses tariffs, protective tariffs. And what he does is he refutes the British economists Adam Smith and Thomas Malthus. This was only implicitly done by Alexander Hamilton in his works on a report on manufacturing, among others. But List explicitly refutes the British system of political economy and stresses the American system. The American system has had of List and Hamilton and Carey has had major impact throughout the world, as Jameson Greer says in his speech. And this includes in China under Sun Yat-sen. List's work, for instance, was translated and published in China in the 1920s. In Russia, where both Carey's writings and List's writings were widely circulated throughout the 1800s, and also in the 1890s and early 1900s by Count Witte, the finance minister of Russia. They were widely circulated in India. They had a major impact on the Japanese Meiji Restoration. A major impact on Germany under Bismarck, even in Canada. So the point here is the American system has already had a broad impact throughout the world. People are familiar with the American system historically. And that has to be the basis. These policies have to be the basis of a new arrangement in global affairs, which brings peace through economic development and cooperation. That is what is on the agenda right now by the Trump administration. That's why it's really crucial that the Republicans win the midterm. Because if the Republicans don't win the midterms, as President Trump has said, he'll be impeached and we'll have paralysis. So what I'm saying is the world can change for the better, even as the United States changes for the better and leads the way. And so that is what is the prospect for the coming period, and hopefully for the next 50 or more years. So thank you very much for watching and listening.